Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Today, I have with me Randy Bean. He is the author of Fail Fast, Learn Faster, Lessons in Data-Driven Leadership in an Age of Disruption, Big Data and AI. He's a contributor for all sorts of publications like Forbes and Harvard Business Review, but also and equally and really relevant to this conversation, a long-term strategic advisor on data analytics to lots of the world's largest companies. And Randy, I've known you for a couple of years now. And it's a pleasure to finally have you back on the show or onto the show for the first time. So welcome along.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. And so the topic we wanted to kick about, because we discussed this a little bit, didn't we, in terms of what will be most relevant for you and I to kind of kick around is there's a lot of talk about how people do data strategies and the role of the chief data officer and all this kind of thing. But the kind of nugget we wanted to get at was what distinguishes organizations that are successful with data against or versus those that aren't successful with data. So that's the kind of the framing of the topic for today. So I guess first up, let's just hear a little bit more about you and your background before we dive into some of that. I've given a very short summary there, but yeah, just a bit about how you got into data in the first place, which might take you back, and then we'll get cracking with the conversation.
Yeah, I'll give you the abbreviated version. I studied English and history when I was in school. I never thought that I'd be in the data or even in the technology field. But when I looked for jobs, they were all in technology. And I took a position with a top 10 bank in the US. And they trained me as a COBOL and assembler programmer. But I was, by instinct, more interested in the data that we were working with as opposed to the instructions in terms of how you move the data. And I remember in one of the my early days with the company, there was these large repositories of information that were stored on customers, basically their customer history, all their transaction history for 7 years. And I said to my manager, who I reported to, I said, so what do we do with all of this rich customer history? And they said, oh, the regulators make us store it in a vault for 7 years, and then we're allowed to destroy it. And I was like, what? Because it just seemed to me that there was such an opportunity to use this information to understand who the best customers were and where your opportunities. So that's really launched my interest in data.
Right.
And I've been at it for more than a generation now in banking, and then worked for a company that was an early innovator in database marketing, which became CRM. And I ran their North America financial services practice working with the major banks and insurance companies in the US and Canada in terms of understanding the totality of their customer relationships so they could get and keep and expand their customer relationships. And then I went to Silicon Valley, did 2 venture-backed startups, one of which was a Kleiner Perkins company. I was a co-founder, pre-funding, and that was great. This was in the 1998 to 2001 period, so the period of the internet bubble. So it was great and wonderful and exciting till everything came collapsing down in 2001. My lesson that I learned from that was never to take a cent in venture money if I could help it. And I started New Vantage Partners, which have run for 20 years until our acquisition by the Paris-based global consultancy Wavestone in December of this past year.
Brilliant. Well, that was a whistle stop and certainly abridged versus other conversations you and I have had. But yeah, I guess the summary for me is you've got a long career and history in data and technology. I think this topic of what distinguishes those that are good at this stuff and those that aren't, you certainly have a good view. And I've been in the space since sort of around the early 2000s. So I got a few years under my belt, maybe not as many as you. So hopefully we can unpick this one for everyone. So let's get this going. Whilst you sort of get going with like the broad question of like, what really is the differentiator here for organizations? There's so many different things to think about: technology and the people you've got and the culture you have and all this kind of stuff. And you've written a book and I've written a book on it, but what what really is it that really sets organizations apart, and the ones that, the sort of the facets, the attributes that that make an organization successful?
Yeah, when I thought about this question, Jason, what I began by doing was writing down some notes, and it turned out there were a list of adjectives, and I could
Nice.
drill down or go deep into any one of those. But let me tick off some of the things that I cited as seeing in truly data-driven organizations. One is resilience. So you don't give up, you stay at it, you work at it for the long term. Another is persistence, which is another way of saying the same thing. In other words, you really need to stick at it. At the same time, you need to be patient. So organizations need to try things, but they need to realize that results come about over time. Business value, if organizations can't point to or identify specific business value that they're getting from data investments, then it's going to be hard to justify those investments. Another is experimentation, and that goes to the book I wrote, which is fail fast, learn faster. The idea is lessons in data-driven leadership. And that's really the idea. If you don't try something, you're not going to innovate in ways that will help you change your business and be more successful.
Yeah.
A few other things: mindset, the need to think differently. So with legacy companies, they're used to operating and thinking in a particular way, so really need to evolve and change that mindset. And then just a couple other things briefly is urgency, having a sense of immediacy, and that if you don't act today, other companies, your competitors, are taking action. So the need for speed, and then just commitment and hard work. Back to that point about it, it's not easy, and those companies that prove to be most successful are the ones that anticipate that.
Yeah, anticipate and plan around it. I mean, it's interesting that it's a great list, and as you say, I think we could probably go back and pick some of these off, but what strikes me is there's, you didn't mention data or analytics or technology, in fact, so which is great, and they're obviously not those things aren't attributes of companies, but that didn't come up. You didn't say they're good with data. You said all sorts of other adjectives that explain what an organization might look like. But there's some things that are a little bit at odds, aren't there? You talk about patience and resilience on one hand, and urgency and immediacy on the other, as an example. And I think organizations can find it quite hard to both have that kind of long, mid and longer term patience that this stuff takes some time, but also get on with it and drive some value out. Is that a tough balancing act for organizations?
Well, it is, because there's ongoing competition between, say, the long view and the short view. And that is, for example, I often tell the story about going into organizations and meeting with their data teams, and they talk about their robust capabilities, and it's very commendable. And meeting with the technology organizations, and they talk about the architectures and the engineering they do, which is equally commendable. And then meeting with line of business leaders and hearing from them, we don't trust the data that we have. We don't have confidence in the data, that we're not receiving the data that we need to make the decisions that we need to make, and the timeliness within which we need to make them.
Yeah.
And part of it points to, often when I speak with the data and technologists, they're developing platforms and capabilities for the long term. So it will serve the organization in terms of producing a better environment to make data more accessible for the long run. But the line of business executives are often being held to day-to-day, quarter-to-quarter measurable results. And if they're not able to demonstrate measurable business value quickly, the organization may never get to the long term, or they may abandon those initiatives or not have the funding for those initiatives. So there has to be a mutual sensitivity to the fact that businesses operate in environments where they have to produce results and show performance in short intervals of time, unless you're a privately held company. And that often competes with investments where in data and architecture initiatives where you don't necessarily see the value for long periods of time.
So I guess one of the things that sort of overlaying that, I guess one of the things that distinguishes companies that are good at this, they find that balance, right? And there needs to be a bit of an understanding between the long and the short term, so that we get it right. Because they
Yeah,
otherwise it's a conflict rather than a kind of marriage made in heaven.
absolutely. And, we counsel organizations to the greatest extent possible to focus on quick wins. In other words, identify the one or two or three business questions that will have the most measurable business impact, and identify what data is needed to support those business questions, because it's not all of the data, it's just some of the data. And as you demonstrate the ability to answer one or two of these questions, that starts to build credibility with the business. And as you repeat that process, then that creates momentum. And that's what we see is, what's missing from a lot of organizations. Probably the question that we're asked more than any other question of Fortune 1000 companies is they say, we've created these great capabilities, but we haven't got buy-in from the business. So that's the major gap that we experience.
In some ways, it's self-fulfilling, isn't it? Because that credibility that you build by delivering some value quickly creates patience. It creates mid and long-term patience, because if you've proven, then you're more likely to have an organization that's like, well, we know we can do this again because we're proven. So therefore we sort of, because impatience comes from not knowing whether you're going to be able to get there sometimes. But if you know you can get there and you can prove that you can get there and you chip away at it, then you sort of, it's self-fulfilling because you build some of that patience into what you're doing.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because you get the benefit of the doubt, because many organizations go into, you hear this talk about, oh, not another data project. So, many organizations have gone through that process where there's been failures or overpromise or expectations that have been set that haven't been able to be matched. So there's this skepticism and caution often when it comes to making sizable investments in data initiatives.
Yeah, but rightly, if people's experiences are that we don't do what we say we're going to do, or it doesn't get done, it doesn't get finished. Interesting. Couple of other ones then that you called out was the kind of mindset shift, and I'm very interested in this space about the kind of dare I say it, sort of modern ways of thinking and acting and behaving that might be different from what's come before it, particularly in traditional, particularly global, particularly fractured organizations. It's quite hard to shift that mindset and implement the sort of practical outcomes that mindset might create. So agility, I think you mentioned when you were talking about it, it's something that as a mindset, it can be quite hard to get through, but the practical application of agility is something that's actually, can be quite difficult for organizations to shift to. So can we just unpick that one a little bit in terms of what you mean by mindset? What are some of the kinds of mindsets that we see exhibited in these organizations that are good at this stuff?
Yeah, well, legacy companies generally get to be legacy companies because they're really good at something, and those companies have existed for generations, if not a century or longer. So when you're asking a company that's been really successful doing a certain thing to potentially change that, in other words, if there was something that you did that made you wildly popular, somebody said, now let's do something different, you'd want to think twice about that. It's complicated by the fact that data is an asset that flows through an organization. So historically, there hasn't been a single point of ownership. And even today, and over the course of the past decade, the establishment of the role of the chief data officer is really a challenge on a practical basis, to establish those points of ownership around data. So, what all of this implies is that organizations need to undergo change. They need to think of data as an asset. They need to establish the processes and structures to manage data as an asset. And all of that is new, in the same way that a decade or a generation ago, 25, 35 years ago, the CIO was a relatively new role, and have written about it. The joke at the time was CIO stood for career is over. In many respects, that's the same challenge that chief data officers run into today, because there's not a uniform set of established expectations in terms of where the role reports, what the responsibilities are. We've seen an evolution in the role, even in recent years, where the analytics component's been brought in. So it's now the chief data and analytics officer So it's really a work in progress. The great news in all of this is it means that there's a lot of work and opportunity for the data profession in the coming years and decades, and not to even mention that data continues to proliferate exponentially, and we've just scratched the surface in terms of unstructured data and how that can be used in decision making.
Yeah, I think you cover a few things there, and that I suppose tying mindset and chief data officer together for a moment, which is where this started, is there's a mindset that data is important, and we're going to use data to help make our decision making, and that's a shift in its own right for some organizations, and then having the sort of focus to then bring someone in at a strategic board exec level to then take some control and some responsibility for creating an organization that acts that way is, again, it's a mindset shift. It's in some ways it's a brave move, in some ways it's a leap of faith, actually, in many cases. And you might have just read it in The Economist or Harvard Business Review that you need one, and that's why you do it, or you genuinely know the values there and you go after it. But all of, like, bringing those two things together, more organizations are taking that leap, though, right? Aren't they? More organizations are having that mindset shift, that even in the ones, as you say, the legacy that are established and have been successful without doing this, and now understanding that to continue being successful, there may be something that needs to change.
Yes, and you still need the human judgment, because otherwise you might as well just have algorithms do everything and we'd all be out of work. So it's really combining the use of data and human judgment to make more informed decisions. One other thing, you haven't really asked the question yet, but one of the things that we're really seeing is more and more organizations confronting challenges and issues around data ethics and data privacy, and what that means for organizations and how organizations think about that data. So starting to see that as perhaps the next frontier in thinking about what it means to be a data-driven organization and what it means to be have data responsibility.
Yeah, where's the just thinking about the things that distinguish an organization that's successful, and are you starting to see then ethics as something people are thinking about, or something people are focused on, or really just a back pocket kind of item that we're going to get to at some point?
It's in its early stages, and as you probably know, conduct an annual survey each year of chief data officers and senior data leaders. But one of the questions that we asked this year was the state of data responsibility and data ethics in your organization. And only 21.6%, to be precise, said the industry has done enough to address data and AI ethics issues. About 44% said that their organization had established policies and practices. So it's still the majority of firms have work to do, and as an industry, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Well, I it's a topic in its own right. I think the kind of the way an organization approaches it, and it kind of touches really on because you don't just think about data ethics in isolation. Are you an organization that is ethical, or how do you go about ensuring that your business and your business practices are ethical, and that you're doing things in a sustainable and responsible way? If you're not an organization that thinks that way, it's going to be a damn sight a lot harder to think about data ethics, because those things are kind of intangibly or sort of tangibly linked. Is that is there some sort of broader context that an organization needs to have culturally to really kind of be successful with data, not just ethics, but just sort of more broadly?
Data-driven organizations, it's in their fundamental DNA. And organizations that are legacy organizations, they can't just transform or develop that DNA overnight.
Yeah.
You take in the U.S. in banking, Capital One, it's a company that's existed just about a generation, so that makes it 100 plus years younger than the other major banks in the U.S. And basically, Capital One was founded by a small team of data and analytics professionals who really were trying to apply data and analytics principles to credit card marketing. So they realized that they could do credit card marketing much more efficiently, and then expanded that to broader notions of banking. So they've done in financial services what, say, Amazon has done in retail. But when you're starting from scratch and you're starting from that data and analytics mindset, you have a greenfield opportunity to create the company on that basis. But if you're operating as a traditional company, you really need to integrate new processes into existing processes, and there's natural resistances to change. So it makes it a challenge for organizations. If I could just cite some data briefly, we ask each year where organizations are on the journey to becoming data driven. And here's 5 metrics that we tracked year after year without much sign of improvement. As a matter of fact, some decreases just because the challenges continue to grow greater. But we asked, are you driving business innovation with data? 56.5% said yes. 45% said no. Are you competing in data and analytics? 47.4% said yes. So more than half said no. Are you managing data as a business asset? 39.7% said yes. So roughly 60% said no. Have you created a data-driven organization? Only 26.5% said yes. So roughly 75% haven't. And lastly, we asked, have you established a data culture? And only 19.3% said yes. So roughly 80% said no. So again, that points to both the challenges as well as the opportunity.
Yeah, kind of interesting, disappointing, insightful, all at the same time, I think, with those results. That last one's quite interesting with the have you established a data culture? Because that I don't think, in some ways, a lot of organizations might not even know what that means, the data culture. I tend to think of that as a culture, an organization that has a culture of using data to help make it better decisions. But it could mean many things. So it's sort of interesting whether the industry and business more broadly sort of understands what it means to have a data culture in that language, and therefore whether that changes over time, and therefore sort of changes the context of what people understand it to be. But have you got a definition that you kind of go by?
Yeah, there's a lot of terminology or categories that are used now to define some of these things, but I generally don't think in those terms. So there's things like data literacy, data democratization, data lineage, and self-service. But for me, having been around a long time, when somebody says, oh, data literacy, I ask them to translate, and I say, oh, you mean this, which was previously called this, which was previously called that, which was then known as something else before that. So it's the idea that, first of all, having people at all levels of organizations understand where data is produced, where it's generated, understand where it's consumed at all points within the bank, not within the bank, I'm referring to banks, but with any particular company, and understanding the points where that data is used to make decisions or improve customer treatment. So the more that professionals at all levels of an organization understand how data is being employed and the importance of data at each stage of the cycle, that at least increases the awareness and hence the literacy and appreciation of the value. But for many organizations, it's we have people that collect the data over here, and there's people that are developing algorithms over here that make decisions about what products and services, but they're not really seen as being closely interconnected, and not a sufficient appreciation of the importance of maintaining and capturing and maintaining the quality of the data.
Really interesting. One of the areas, just going back to your list of adjectives that you gave to articulate the differences between successful organizations, those that aren't, was almost for me the most important, which was business value. And I guess one of the mistakes that I see many organizations make is not focusing enough on that. They focus on capabilities and building capabilities and solving some of the things we've just been talking about around technology, around getting in the right people. but the focus on the value that all those things and all those capabilities that you bring in are focused on delivering. That's the bit that often gets missed. So are you kind of, I mean, it sort of feels really obvious to say actually, but are you kind of saying the ones that are successful, the ones that focused on business value, or is it a little bit more nuanced than that?
Well, we think that things should always begin with business value, and to a certain degree, we see that it's important for organizations to manage both the technology side of data, which is really the enablement and making data value available and supportive of business decisions. And then there's the business side of data, which is really working with organizations to understand what are the most important high value use cases where data can be put to work. And you can leverage that data that's being created from the technology side of the business and the platforms. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's always about the business value of data. That's always the starting point. If you can't point to the primary benefits and measures that are being realized as a result of your data initiative, it's a little bit of if you build it, they will come, as opposed to being driven by questions and applications that directly impact your ability to enter new markets or to grow your customer relationships and activities of that kind that can be very measurable in terms of their impact to an organization.
How does that tie in, do you think, with we've written a whole book on this, so I hope you've got a good one here, but with experimentation, because again, it's maybe sort of ties in with mindset as well, but there's the way organizations have traditionally kind of done business cases that you just mentioned there, upfront business case about how much value this project's going to deliver. And, it's potentially a 2-year program. And that's the value that we're trying to deliver, after we finish the program or once the sort of technology has been implemented. But the experimentation approach is much more, well, we don't know. We don't have all the answers. We don't know when we're going to get there. We don't know what's going to be successful, what's not. We don't know kind of the nature of the direction until we've tried it a bit and got some feedback. How does a good organization marry the need to do experimentation and only focus on the things that are successful, therefore driving you closer towards business value, and the desire and the thirst for kind of upfront, clarity over the benefits that the investment, the longer term investment, will deliver?
Yes, exactly. So, I use the metaphor of fail fast, learn faster, but, it applies to notions such as test and learn, which is very common in analytics. But the organizations that, my experience that see as most successful are organizations that start off with a group or some subset that's focused on these issues, call it a center of excellence, an innovation practice, an analytical sandbox, a data lab, or whatever the case may be. We see a number of organizations that have done that successfully. And basically what they do is they take, one business problem that's carved off from the production stream, and they use that as a guinea pig or a test case. And when they have repeated successes, then they can migrate those capabilities into production. So in the early 2000s, was working with Wells Fargo Bank on the west coast of the U.S., and Wells Fargo was in proximity to Silicon Valley as opposed to the major East Coast banks. And so Wells Fargo was a very early adopter of, what was then called internet banking. Today it would be called digital, but they created something called their Internet Services Group. And they started basically using that as a new channel to market to their customer, and applying data and analytics to optimize the use of the online channel most effectively to customers. And in the early days, it started off that whatever the number was, 5% of the customers of the bank came in through that online internet channel. But within 4 or 5 years, it was 50% of the bank. So the point is it started as a incubation area, but within 4 or 5 years, it became the mainstream and the primary channel that customers interacted with the organization. So that's an example of a significant transformation that took place in a short period of time. And now internet channel or the online digital channel as the primary and there's whole major banks, Ally Financial and others, that they're entirely organized around the digital channel.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, in digital channels, you tend to be able to iterate a little faster. You can make changes, you can test, you can have different people, interacting with different experiences and pick the one that works the best a little bit more than you can in, say, a physical retail store or a bank, walk-in bank. So it's interesting that does that kind of suggest a more agile and iterative investment strategy then, smaller incremental releases of funds rather than big tranches of funds to do a major governance or major data platform program? This is much more kind of incremental spend and releasing funds as we've proven value.
Or significant spend in many incremental things.
Yes, of course. Yeah. You're still allowed to spend a lot of money. Yes, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, because why not do 100 experiments?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it depends upon the organization. We've done a lot of work with Fidelity Investments, and Fidelity Investments is a privately held family company, and so they haven't been hesitant to spend many significant amounts of money on multiple different initiatives because they haven't had to do the public reporting that a public company would, so that they can basically invest in I don't know what they'd say about it, but the venture capital model, you invest in 100 things, and if one of them hits absolute home run, you made much more than you would if you had invested in a handful of higher, just a smaller set of portfolio items.
I actually had I think his role as the chief data officer, maybe the data science director at an online retailer, and there's the sort of story internally that the founders were down to their last $1,000, and they were sort of early days and struggling, and they wanted to invest that in marketing to try and sort of push and drive the customer base. And instead of sort of a one or two campaigns that spend $1,000, they did 100 $10 marketing campaigns, and they saw which ones worked, and some were very successful, and you got the return and you invested it back in those channels. So yes, very, very on board with the idea of broad spend and broad incremental spend. But I guess the idea of incremental release of money only at point of which you've sort of proven value, and maybe there's some throwaway cash to the point. You don't know what's going to work until you've put it out there.
Yeah, it's been an ongoing issue for decades. Centralized type of activities where there's massive levels of investment versus highly decentralization of investments and investing in many different things. I think this is just a personal opinion, but I think for innovation you need to invest in many decentralized activities and initiatives that are closest to the customers. Mm-hmm. When you're trying to realize the efficiencies, once you've gotten to that point of success, then you can centralize activities so that you're not being redundant, and you can realize the benefits of scale, et cetera. But my experience has tended to be that innovation happens around the edges on a centralized basis, and once you've achieved it, you have to basically maintain that balance. You have to take the capabilities that are successful and then centralize those, but not rob the edges of the ability to innovate.
Yeah, I sometimes term that as sort of putting it on rails. Once it's successful, put it on rails so that it can be repeated. But there's kind of a case for, and I think you mentioned this earlier, so there's kind of a case for self-service in some ways. And there's probably a whole nother topic, just deep diving into that. But the idea of self-service is to put the data and insights and analytics into the hands of the edges, really. And that if that's where innovation happens, then let's get the people the data. Yes. Whereas that sort of central control, if you do that too early, you stifle rather than enable that pace.
Yeah, well, I'd say I'm a huge fan of self-service. I mean, ultimately, you have to bring those learnings back to the center and share those learnings,
Mm.
because otherwise you wind up with the situation that many organizations face. For example, I'll use pharmaceutical industry as an example. And we've seen that they've really increased their investments in data and analytics significantly over the past few years. And a lot of that's been driven by the COVID pandemic and developing vaccines and understanding the epidemiological issues in terms of positivity and spread and things of that kind. But the challenge that many pharmaceuticals companies had was their product development activities were highly decentralized. So they had all these pockets of data and none of that was being shared. And only when they started sharing the data, they started seeing correlations between things that they might not have expected previously that had meaningful indicators in terms of vaccine development and other activities. So yes, organizations benefit when they get to that point where they can share data across the enterprise, but enabling more and more pockets within a company to become capable in terms of their data capabilities, that is a good way to not only foster a more data-driven culture, but also to innovate in the business.
Brilliant. Well, I to wrap up, I want to look forward a bit more. I think we talked a lot about how things have been done and sort of right here, right now. But do you think any of this changes going forward in terms of what will allow organizations to stand out and be successful? Or is this really because they're adjectives, they're kind of underlying behaviors really, so that they may run true. But is there something different organizations need to do going forward than what's come before? And if so, what are a couple of those things you think?
Well, sometimes I speak to old timers that at the end of their careers and they've said, oh, things have been this way for like 30, 40 years. And so, they won't change over the next 30 or 40. And I think there's some healthy skepticism in that, but I also think that the maturity is continuing to evolve significantly. Yeah. So we're learning from the benefits of experience. As you said, organizations are becoming more agile, more flexible, more adaptive. The cloud has created much greater flexibility. Computing power has grown exponentially. So I think things are on a good trajectory. There'll always be cultural issues in terms of centralization and decentralization and resistance to change, and there'll be newer and newer capabilities, and the people that are the greatest advocates of change or adoption of new capabilities today might be the most resistant to the next set of capabilities tomorrow. We see that, but I think from a long-term perspective, organizations are absolutely on a trajectory to become more data-driven, but it will play out over years and in some respects in decades as well. It's not a destination that you get to and then you get to sit back and relax and pick up your feet and say, hey, we're data-driven. We're there. Yeah. Now we can relax. It's an ongoing process of reinvention and persistence and continuity.
In the same way that business is. So as long as business is doing that, then data will follow. Well, Randy, it's been brilliant having you on the show. Fascinating to talk to you through all these things, and yeah, good insight into what organizations need to think about to be successful. So appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks very much.
Jason, it's always a pleasure seeing you and always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks, Randy. And thanks everyone for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show.